Let's face it, we're not all mathematicians, we're gamers. Well, some of you are probably good at math, but the rest of us? After each test, we brain dumped anything having to do with numbers into outer space faster than Stephen Hawking could say.
Quantum physics.
Thankfully for you, Youkai is here to show you that in Amazon's new world, you don't need to be good with digits to make big gameplays, or understand the basics of how damage works. Here's Youkai's guide to understanding damage in New World in under 7 minutes. Every enemy in New World has vulnerabilities and resistances to different types of damage. If they're vulnerable, they'll take bonus damage. If they're resistant, they will take less damage to that type of attack. You can tell what kind of damage your current opponent is vulnerable or resistant to by the damage markers that pop up while fighting them. If the 2 arrows are pointed up, your opponent is vulnerable. If the 2 arrows are pointed down and the text is blue, then they are resistant. If the text is gray or white, they're neither vulnerable nor resistant. That's just your normal damage. And if the text and icon are orange, it is a critical. Green is obviously a heal of some sort. Critical attacks have a percentage to occur on hit. This number is dependent on any number of things. Each weapon is assigned a base percentage chance to critical from 2 to 5%, as well as a damage increase modifier that is equivalent from 1.2 to 1.5%. For us non-mathematicians, all that means is the bigger number is better. You want criticals to happen more often and to hit harder. Attacking an enemy from behind with a melee weapon will always be a critical, and this is commonly referred to as backstab damage. Some abilities in the game will increase damage done in this manner specifically. Headshots with certain ranged weapons, currently bows and muskets namely, are also guaranteed to critical. Hatchet also has a perk in the throwing tree which allows them to critical on headshots but also raises the base crit chance. Due to the nature of these mechanics, it is best to adhere to the common facing technique when running group content, which is to face the enemy away from allies, usually done by the tank or whoever is maintaining aggro, threat, or attention to maximize damage potential. When attacking the enemy or being attacked, the damage markers that appear indicate not only vulnerabilities and weakness, but which type of damage is being done via the corresponding icon. There are currently 3 physical damage types and 6 types of elemental damage. To clarify any New World terminology confusion, strike damage is normally referred to as bludgeoning damage, and thrust damage is normally referred to as piercing damage in other video games or tabletop RPGs. The physical types are slash, strike, and thrust. The elemental types are fire, ice, nature, lightning, void, and arcane. Hammers, and for some abilities, shields, do strike damage. Sword does slash and thrust damage, depending on whether you're doing a light or heavy attack. Hatchet and great axe do slash damage. Bow, musket, spear, and rapier all do thrust damage. The life staff does nature damage. Ice gauntlet does ice damage, of course, and the fire staff does fire damage. While some weapons may drop with a gem already slotted into them, which grants additional damage types, the common way of gaining a second elemental damage type on a weapon to maximize damage effectiveness against vulnerable opponents is to place a damage-specific gem into a slotted weapon yourself. While it will help you in leveling, in early game gems are not too important, however it is suspected that they will be important in future content such as hard mode dungeons, or to be released PvE content such as maybe raids or world bosses. There are multiple tiers of gems, most have 5 tiers at the moment, increasing the gem's potency as they improved. It is suspected that there may be more tiers later on, such as legendary, as the difficulty of released content improves. Gems are normally found raw or uncut. Stone cutting is required to cut these raw gems into items that you can drop into weapons or armor with slots. There are a wide variety of gems that you can slot into weapons to do things such as increase their damage percentage to different types of enemies. Here are some examples of the kind of damage specific gems there are. Some will allow you to add bonus damage equal to a non-standard attribute. Others boost damage under specific conditions, such as your enemy being lower than a certain percentage of health or currently suffering from a debuff or crowd control effect. Adding certain gems into your weapon will also change or add a percentage of an elemental damage type. Gemmed armor also has a number of possibilities, the most damage specific ones doing things such as absorbing a certain type of damage or granting damage reduction versus certain monsters. Many weapon abilities and perks from weapons, armor, or gems further augment what is known as condition damage, such as damage over time, or DOTS for short. Currently there are bleeding, burning, and poison. Burning tends to do the most damage in a small amount of time, bleeding appears to be the most persistent and is applied quickly by weapons such as the rapier if properly invested in, and poison tends to have the longest lasting duration of damage over time. All 3 of these deal a percentage of your maximum weapon damage over a set amount of time, which is normally determined by investment in an active weapon skills mastery tree. You'll find that weapons that have trees that focus on a damage over time, such as bleeding or poison, will allow you to invest into perks. These perks do things such as increasing the duration of applied buffs if you hit your opponent while affected, or grant a higher damage tick per second for the dot. Some will allow you to just flat out do more damage to an opponent who is under the effect of something such as poison or burn. There are also damage boosting perks or abilities which allow you to do more damage by boosting your abilities or lowering those of your enemies. Most of these abilities are capped, going as high as 50%, with the exception of Rend, which caps at 30%. Rend lowers your opponent's actual armor rating, allowing anyone who hits them to do more damage. Currently, Spear is the best weapon for stacking Rend, with its 3-stab attack called Perforate on the Impaler tree. When invested into, each successful strike of the weapon skill adds 10% of the 30% cap. Hit 3 times, boom, 30% Rend. The weapon ability Grit makes your attacks unblockable. Many melee weapons have this ability and utilize it greatly to chain attacks. And the buff Empower grants a damage boost. A lot of abilities and perks stack to increase the percentage of the damage gained from this ability. There are also damage negating abilities and debuffs, such as personal buffs that are temporary conditions. Usually these are granted by a weapon skill or activated by a perk. The oh so valued Fortify increases your armor by a percentage for a set amount of time. This is seen in a lot of aggressive melee builds, but is also found in a lot of tank abilities or healing staff abilities. The debuff Weaken lowers your opponent's damage for an amount of time. The debuff Exhaust lowers your opponent's stamina regeneration for an amount of time. And the debuff Disease lowers how much health someone receives. Less common is the debuff known as Shock, which is normally an enemy NPC debuff that applies damage to stamina over time instead of health damage. Also deserving a mention are invincibility frames. If you're not familiar with invincibility frames, this is a common way to refer to a small amount of time that your character is completely immune to things such as damage or crowd control effects. This is usually measured in frames per second. The best representation of something that grants invincibility frames would be the dodge roll in New World or almost any other game, and a New World specific one would be the evade ability in the Rapier's Grace Tree, which grants a short duration of invulnerability. And lastly, here's a quick rundown of enemy vulnerabilities and resistances, or the best and worst damage types against each type of foe in New World. If a damage type is not mentioned, that means that it'll do damage unaltered by resistance or vulnerability. I'll read them in order of best to worst for both resistance and vulnerability. Against the Ancients, they are weak to lightning by 30%, strike damage by 20%, and void by 15%. They're also resistant to fire by 40% and slashing damage by 15%. Against the Angry Earth, they are weak to fire by 30%, slash by 20%, and they are resistant to both lightning and thrust damage by 40 and 15% respectively. Against the Corrupted, they are weak to arcane damage by 30%, thrust damage by 20%, nature damage by 15%, and they are resistant to both ice damage by 40% and strike damage by 15%. Against the Lost, they are weak to nature damage by 30%, ice damage by 15%, and strike damage by 10%. The Lost are also resistant to void damage by 40% and thrust damage by 15%. Against Beasts, or what are generally animals, they are currently vulnerable only to thrust damage by 20%, and they actually have no resistances. Whew, that's a whole lot in just under 7 minutes. I'll see you all on the 28th in Aeternum.